items of this talk is try to explain how someone that works in neuroscience ends up working in finance. I hope that this might shed some light on how that might happen. So obviously I followed Tommaso for many years, so I know what you do, and I'm not here to lecture you about complexity science, or you won't see many equations. I'm more interested about the concepts, how you can use fractals ideas to understand complex or actually complicated systems, and obviously the brain is probably the most complicated system out there. And then how even very simple ideas can then be used very efficiently in everyday practical problems as trading stocks. Okay, I think I introduced what I had to introduce. So I'll start from the beginning, or at least, and I'm sure you are familiar with these very old books. Just by reading these books, I've noticed quite a few interesting things at the time that I'm sure you're familiar with. There was something about how fractals can be empirically useful because they sort of look like financial time series. Some multifractals, in fact, are very well suited to describe volatility dynamics. This was one of the intuitions in those books at the time. So you can use this stuff to stress your portfolio and test it. The one thing that actually was striking for me was that there was more a focus on volatility as the main focus of the modeling, more than what usually you try to do with stocks, which is trying to predict trajectories and trends. That was something that I found really cool. But we have to admit that for many, many years, fractal geometry, fractal mathematics wasn't very successful in explaining things. It wasn't used very much. Until obviously this was looked at in terms of systemic risk and complexity science. And I just want to take you through a journey that I've done through how we can use these objects to understand, not predict trajectories at all, but try to predict market states and their changes. As you know, prediction is a tough job in financial markets. So, as I said, I want to emphasize the interpretative part of this. So how can we use this mathematics to understand? And I have to talk to you about brain and how we can build and try and understand how actually the brain works quite in simpler way than usual. Now you're all familiar with fractals. I don't think I need to explain again how they came about. If you try to measure something natural like coastline, this is a classic example. You can have in different books different numbers just because ordinary geometry doesn't work. And there are useful concepts like fractal dimension that basically tells you how much a certain natural object fills space. And I think the journey starts from here because it turns out that fractals are obviously everywhere. I put up some of these fractals up there. Some of these are actually pieces of brain. So this one is. This is actually Finland. This is the Wheels circle. This is a lung. This is also a piece of brain. This is the Nile. And this is me getting bored waiting for my children to get out of some sort of park situation, not wanting to deal with the other parents, and so taking pictures of the sky. So they are everywhere, and so why shouldn't just we use them? I'm an engineer by training, so to measure things. It turns out that the brain, particularly the big hat, which is on top of the brain nuclei, the cortex, is a fractal object. And if you want to do any quantitative work, structural work on the brain, the best thing you can do is actually use fractals and fractal geometry. As a fractal dimension of 2.7, and this has been replicated many times, which means the filling factor is pretty high. But it's fascinating in many ways because it's not just obviously a structure, it's not just as now, but it's in the end an information processing tool. Being in computing, I'm sure you might have some interest in how such an object can be such a good information processing.
How did they measure the 2.7?
Sorry?
How did they measure the 2.7?
You need to get to a reference. This is one. I think we moved the boxing, simple boxing thing. But also, one of the biggest problems in neuroscience for many, many years has been the following. So there is a bunch of people studying neurobiology, understanding the basics, the microbiology of the brain, the tissues, the neurons, the astrocytes and the rest. And then there's another bunch of people where I work at the Institute of Psychiatry, who look at your behavior, and the whatever disorder your behavior might have. Psychiatric disorders are disorders of behavior. The problem has always been linking the biology with the behavior. It's a big jump, and you need a model to do that. And there are so many levels and so many scales that unless you have something that is straightforward and simple, understanding diseases like autism, schizophrenia, depression, in terms of changes in the basic neurobiology of your system, so far has failed. I mean, there are psychologists out there that have no idea how a piece of brain tissue is composed. In the same way, most people that study neurobiology are not really interested in the big problems of brain and mind, etc. So I think the big focus everywhere, also here, you have a fantastic Institute of Neurology here at UCL, is trying to bridge these two very far schemes. And the only people that actually can do that is probably you, engineers, physicists. I don't think biologists can do that. I don't think clinicians, forget about that, that can really bridge the gap. Okay, so I'll show you how a tentative model of the brain works looks like. So if I were to ask you what is we need to start from the elementary unit. And I'm sure that if I asked you what is the elementary unit of brain, you would say, well, the neuron. And actually that is not true. So if you look at this slide, this is where the skull is on top, and this is where the projections are coming from thalamus. That's the cortex. And these are the different areas of the cortex. So these big neurons are excitatory neurons. They are called pyramidal neurons. These branching-like neurons are instead inhibitory neurons. And they are layer 5 and layer 2. Now what you're looking at is a simple 2-neuron unit, which is a feedback, either a feedback inhibition or feed-forward inhibition. And that is the basic way the brain works. How is that coming about? Probably you don't need this slide to understand that. But every time you have excitation, because you have an inhibition, you have something like what you've seen before. And so even a continuous signal is transformed into a wave. So pick up any electric signal that you see in brain is a wave. And this is how it is generated by a simple feedback system. Nothing complicated there, okay? But it doesn't stop here. If you look carefully, these inhibitory neurons also inhibit on the side. So when, say, a current goes through one of these neurons, this is inhibiting the one on the side. So if you are, say, familiar with wavelets or some of these object wavelet filters, that is pretty much what your cortical, what your cortex is, visual cortex, for example, or auditory cortex is doing. understanding is not just having your brain excited by something, but also suppressing something else. Suppression is as important as excitation when you try to process a signal. So this is called lateral inhibition, and it's as important. When the signal comes through, you have waves going this way, and you start seeing the waves going laterally. This is an example. I hope that the screen is clear enough to see. Now, if you play with PowerPoint and you try to have two homogeneous squares and you combine them, you might have noticed that you've probably seen a white line in the middle here. That white line actually does not exist. It's your brain that is creating that illusion. And why? Because our brains are not well suited to see very sharp edges. So you can move this thing, you can try home, two squares, different colors. There will always be a white line in the middle. It's nothing to do with you, it's nothing to do with PowerPoint, it's just the way the brain works. So this is lateral inhibition. So remember this, because this becomes important later. So ultimately, when a signal comes through the brain, what actually happens is very similar to what happens to when you throw a rock into a pond. So you have waves going everywhere. Okay? So it's not just following a single path, but this signal is spreading around. Why is that? Because at the end of the day, at this moment you are looking at me, so you're looking at someone a bit old, maybe a bit boring, probably overweight, and you're sort of putting all this info all together. So that is called featuring assembly. Okay, there are billions of neurons that are responding to myself, my voice, my appearance, and how do you bind together all these signals? And I'm pretty sure that if I mention weakly coupling, you might understand what I mean. I brought in a movie, probably for people like you, it's probably not necessary, but so let me explain what I'm trying to show here. These are metronomes. You're familiar with that? Because it's Brexit time, these are German metronomes. I'll try to get a visa for them soon. The point of this initial thing is, as you know, synchronizing anything in nature is very difficult. So the only way you can do it is by simple gadgets like this, when you put your metronomes on, say, a couple of cans, and they get synchronized straight away, okay? The brain works exactly like that. You see the energy spreading out, so the signal of one neuron gets synchronized with whatever is there. Let me see if I can speed this up. Okay, now, this is interesting. This one has a frequency which is much faster than the other two. As you can see, whether it's in antiphase or in the same phase, these two are pulling this one. Look at this, now it's trapped. Okay? It gets synchronized for a certain time and then desynchronized. So what's happening here is what we call bottom-up synchronization or top-down synchronization. Bottom-up synchronization is when seemingly different inputs just come together and form a bigger object, a bigger synchronized object. In the same way, if you have already that object in your mind and you get into a room and there's some expectation that that object is in the room, your big neuronal masses will bully your sensory cortices and convince you that that object is there, even if it's not. Okay? So this is the way the brain actually works. It's either bottom-up or top-down. There is obviously, so you can imagine the brain as a huge, large set of oscillators of different size, from the very small to the very big, that keep getting in synchrony or out of synchrony. And that what that does is maximizes information processing, it maximizes memory formation, and so on and so forth. Now, there are no fractals yet, okay? We have not talked about it. But funny enough, evolution then steps in. And what evolution does, it shapes the distribution of these networks. And it turns out that in our brains, as mostly everything, is shaped into sort of small world type of network, which I'm pretty sure you're familiar with. And the reason is because this is the optimal way an information processing tool works. So, and is this actually the case? Yes. So, I think a lot of the neuroscience has been so far used in order to show that whether we, how from these small signals we can get using small world, self-similar, fractal sort of developments and move to the biggest signal. So whether we use cell-based recordings, whether we use EEG, whether we use functional MRI, signal at different scales. This is what we've done at Imperial for many years. So this is the two-point correlation function of one of these instrumentations that I don't have much time to go through. We find the very familiar power laws. This is spatial, and this is because we can record this signal through time. We can the same thing using the Fourier transform. If you're interested, all this work has been done using functional MRI. You have a scanner here as well. MRI usually is used to image the structure of the brain, but you can use it also to measure function because oxyhemoglobin when it has paramagnetic properties, so you can follow these signals for from time like 10-20 minutes, repeat with very fast acquisitions, and so you have both spatial and time distributions of these signals. Both structural and functional signals are indicating that the brain is a fractal object. That is nice, but you may ask yourself, so what? Okay, so we can continue our scientific careers and keep writing papers showing that all these signals are fractal, that whenever we have a new piece of instrumentation, say an MEG, oh, look, it's fractal. Oh, this is fractal, and so on and so forth. Which we have done, admittedly, for a while. But is this informative? Is this allowing us to make predictions? Importantly, is this allowing us to make predictions about behavior? Because, that's ultimately what we want to do. So we started thinking about this before trying to show you understand what this actually means. One other bit of information is that what this model allows us to do is, in any case, because it's a model, we know that the elementary bit is basically a feedback system with excitation and inhibition. We can build simulations, change excitation and inhibition ratios. A lot of the neurotransmitters in your brain, the big neurotransmitters, that's all they do. They change excitation and inhibition in different areas of the brain. So it's like a dial. And we can observe these amazing signals, both at the microscale, but the same thing works at the microscale. So this, for example, is the whole of your brain. If you take the biggest possible scale, at the moment, if you're listening to me, then you are probably unable to have any inner thought. So if you attend to an external stimulus, you cannot at the same time think about your girlfriend or your holiday or anything like that. Vice versa, if you have issues, personal issues, they are so worrying you, then you probably are not actually listening to anything I'm saying, and that's fine. All I'm saying is that there is this alternation. So the same thing you observe at the microscale So that in order to see a signal, you need to inhibit, to have proper lateral inhibition. To properly function in this world, you have to have this. You have to separate inner thinking from outer stimuli, and vice versa. Okay? And one can make the prediction that any problem you have at the micro level will then be flipped through scales and affect your micro behavioral brain and give you behavioral issues. So what we actually built is an avatar, because at the end of the day, behavior is the interaction between brain and environment. And how on earth are we going to simulate that? Well, we used the connectome, so which is coming out of the connectome, human connectome project, which is this project that actually works out all the networks in the brains at different scales. And we can simulate dynamics on this realistic network. And so you can observe these dynamics and be very happy about them, but they are not really very meaningful. You can then, however, send this signal through some game. We have people in the department who spend a lot of time on games. And so we have this avatar, which is a little man, that is a motor avatar at the moment, but can perceive and can make autonomous decisions. We're not doing anything about what he's doing. There is a brain, there is a connectome brain making all these decisions for him. And I don't have the movie here, but for example, if you increase too much the excitation and you put this avatar into a room, then usually he can navigate the room very, very easily and get out of the room. What he will do, he will just go through a wall and just keep hitting the wall. Now, if you've seen a seriously autistic child, this is exactly how they behave. Autistic children have their brains, they are too much excited. So they get overwhelmed by external inputs. So this is why you try to manage the issue by trying to lower the amount of information that they get. On the other hand, for example, schizophrenia, and then I'll show you a clear case example of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is thought to be, schizophrenia, sorry, for you, there are experts. So it's made of positive and negative symptoms. The positive symptoms, the psychotic symptoms, are essentially delusions. So you live in a world where you hear voices, you have visions, that gives you some sort of confused thought. And obviously in the most serious cases, that makes you unable to function normally. It is thought to be a problem with interneurons. And as a matter of fact, people that have schizophrenia have big difficulties in seeing contrasts. Okay? Interestingly enough, you can expand the inhibition problem to the bigger scale. And what that tells you is that people with schizophrenia have problems in understanding the difference between an external signal and an internal signal. So this is what the delusion really is. They think they're hearing voices. In fact, it's their own voice they are listening to. They think they have visions, but, or vice versa. They keep mixing reality with inner thought. And that at a certain point becomes a serious issue. I brought here an example of one of the first known schizophrenics. There was a nice Van Gogh exhibition recently. Van Gogh, you're familiar with Vincent Van Gogh, I presume, is an interesting subject because he painted all his production in 10 years. He didn't sell a single painting during his lifetime. It was maintained by his brother. And he died by shooting himself. And although at the time schizophrenia was not a very well-known disorder, by the description of his that we got from historical records, we think he had psychosis. The interesting bit is that we can follow his art through the different stages of his disease. And I chose self-portraits because he made a lot of self-portraits in those, actually, this is even less than 10 years. Actually, this is 4 years, and as you can see, we start here when he came here to work in London. Usually there is a stressful event that starts the first psychotic episode, and that was probably the fact that he fell in love with the daughter of his landlady. He was rejected, and because of this love loss, he came back to Paris and started painting. There was nothing at the beginning. As you can see, this is a classic 1800 self-portrait. But then, so the way I decided to quantify this is I'm using the autocorrelation function of the painting. We start here in Paris, 1886. And as you can see, we started having a much bigger increase in contrast in the late 1886. This is where he starts having delusions. He starts having delusions, and we believe that his interneurons are not functioning that well. So he needs to put more contrast in his paintings. Then he gets into an asylum, so he gets some treatment, and situation gets better. But then he gets out of Paris, he goes into art. Gauguin was one of his friends. Now he's not feeling well. Gauguin goes and tries to find him, and then there is the famous earlobe incident. He tries to kill Gauguin. He assaulted him with a knife, and then he realized, because someone was speaking to him and telling him that Gauguin needed to be killed. Fortunately, he didn't do that. But he then went back home and he cut his earlobe. And as you can see, there is a big jump in the autocorrelation function. He gets then treated, but the situation gets bad again, and he gets into the Selfsimilar, which is a hospital. At the time, they didn't have proper antipsychotic medication, so all the treatment was just trying to find some sort of calming environment for them. At the end of the day, when he kills himself with the gun.
So the autocorrelation is within the pen.
Yeah.
So pixel by pixel.
Pixel by pixel. It's nothing particularly sophisticated. I'm actually open to better suggestions than this. So you may say, well, you're just fishing. This may be unique because this should apply to any other artist who went through the same disorder. Well, allow me to introduce you to Louis Wayne.
But so the autocorrelation is a proxy for the contrast you
Yeah.
designed.
Yeah, that's all. I'm not claiming any sophistication here, more than that.
And there are like 30 data points because there are 40 pictures, but it took only...
Yeah, as a matter of fact, as you can see, it's very good. Yeah. But this, Louis Wayne, he was a graphical designer. Again, he suffered from schizophrenia. The problem with this is we don't have the dates, but he was a famous... he designed cats. But it's pretty obvious what's going on here. And he's even more extreme. Yes. So we can probably explain a lot of this by the need for them simply to see contrast better. But what about so this is, if you wish, is not completely satisfactory explanation because it simply tells us about the micro structure. This is about visual cortex. What about the bigger structure? Because at the end of the day, we may laugh about these things, or we may look at these paintings, but clearly Van Gogh has some effect on you because I love this painter. It's telling me something that other painters don't do. And I think you may agree on the fact that this self-portrait is telling you something different from this. What is different? So, probably, if I may, this is probably more aesthetically pleasing. In the sense that it's more realistic. but this is probably more artistic. It might be fishing something in your inner soul. Well, which is actually the definition of abstract art. Abstract art is the ability somehow, or maybe not reporting art in the same detail as it is, but accessing your inner thoughts. And as a matter of fact, some studies done here and in other places show that the definition of an artistic experience is not just the activation of your visual cortex, but is the activation of those areas that I showed before that it's called the formal network. This is the part of your brain which usually is activated when you have inner thoughts. So one interpretation of this is the blue sky, is that we love the art of Van Gogh because Van Gogh was able, with these paintings, to allow us to access our internal thoughts and our internal feelings. What other artists that are obviously better at depicting reality cannot do. Okay, so what does it have to do this with finance? I guess that was the question. I think going back to a bit of reality, one thing that was obviously interesting from the networks is, and I know you are expert in networks, is the fact that timing. I use this as an example to explain how timing is important. So you're walking into a forest and somehow you see a sticky object coming out of the ground. The signal goes straight to the amygdala, which is one of the basic nuclei, and immediately you will have the fight or flight reaction. It takes just a millisecond. Why? Because that's evolutionarily makes a lot of sense. This is one of those situations where you don't need to think too much about it. You just have to make a very quick decision. So you jump, and actually this happened to one of my colleagues working in Algeria. She was anyway. Forget about that. At the same time, though, the signal goes up. All signals go through the thalamus, goes into the cortex, and obviously the cortex is a much more sophisticated processing tool. So, and it can distinguish whether whatever you have seen, obviously memories come through. It can actually check whether what is there is actually a snake or is just a piece of wood. The only problem is that it takes a bit more time for the cortex to actually process that signal. So this is a very quick reaction time, and this is a longer reaction time. So you can start saying that time is a key parameter in when we look at complex rational system. As a matter of fact, this is the definition of a rational system. Something which is very quick and rough is what we would call an irrational system. The only thing that makes us rational is just the time that it takes for information to be processed and integrated. Okay. Short delay circuits allow rapid automatic response, as you longer term circuits allow information integration and warrant system stability. Okay, so you need both in order to optimize the system. And one easy way to look at this in any system, I know you're familiar with the Hurst exponent, is when you look at the variability of a signal, and you can interpret the structure of the variability through time, depending on whether it's the long-term variability is longer or it's bigger or shorter than the short-term variability. Obviously, if you have a system that has large long-term variability, trending if you wish, that system is very stable. If not, if the shorter-term variability predominates, you have a chaotic system. Again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know yet. I know you've done work in this area, so Are financial markets fractal object? Probably not all of the time, but they can be analyzed with indicators like the Hurst exponent, and they show there is noise, of course, but behavior that this is a Darwin Jones a long time that goes from being white to show some trend, some long-term correlation. Okay, so you may also be familiar with the interpretations of this signal, if they're really. So what are the contributions of the signals at different scales? Well, you can interpret the signal at different time delays as the contribution of either short-term or long-term or medium-term actors. So if you have a comparatively similar size number of agents will have different horizons, they will take different views. Those who work on the short-term time horizon allow faster reactivity, and they are useful because they ensure liquidity, so prices are checked every time. People that have with a longer horizon, they provide the stability, and this is where we started getting interested in this, because if we could actually work out some prediction. Just before, there is a website of the Bank of England which we got interested in, where they actually looked at this, and we started talking to them a few years ago, that they were obviously interested in systemic risk and trying to get some indicators of how the system was stable, because they were thinking of ways of intervening, again playing on time, maybe putting in delays on the clearance of exchanges and so on and so forth. And this gave us some ideas. Unfortunately, because this is IP of Algebris, I cannot give you some details, but I'll just give you the basic concept. So we came out with these that are called indicators. They are pretty similar to Hurst, but different from Hurst. I think these are indicators that they have a time horizon that can predict the state of the market up to 5 days at the moment. And what we're looking for, and these are numbers from 0 to 1, and they can indicate, given a portfolio, they will give you whether that portfolio is in the next 1 to 5 days is going to be stable, or there is high systemic risk, or nothing. It indicates that it's not in fractal state, so nothing much useful there, or there's some sort of herding behavior, so it's sort of trending. And this has turned out to be extremely useful. And how do we know that this stuff works? As you know, making predictions in financial markets, so is backward testing. Everybody is successful at that. Prediction is a completely different job. So in 2015, we had as seed investor, we had Banca Intesa, and also we were in contact with the Bank of Italy and the ECB, people in there. So every day we started sending this signal in the evening, and my bet was that it would be able to predict market instability in the next 1 to 5 days, and it actually was able to pick most of the volatility. So until 2015 was obviously in sample. After 2015 was out of sample, and we were able to predict. I can send you the time courses if you want. For the Eurostock 50, we were able to predict the volatility stages. So what we're trying to do at the moment at Algebris is we have already a market neutral strategy that works quite well. As you know, market neutral strategies make money when there is volatility. So it's not difficult to make volatility with market neutral strategy. It's very easy to lose money when there is no volatility. So the key is trying to develop the portfolio when you expect market stress and close the portfolio when that market stress is not coming out. As you know, in the last 3 or 4 years, market neutral has been very difficult because of central bank interventions that sort of flatten volatility for long times. And now we are developing these strategies also for different kinds of portfolios, verifying that there is a ability to predict, which is, as you know, is difficult. And I think I am finished with my talk. So if you have any questions. These are just the people that contribute to the academic work. Most of them were done with, and Tommaso is familiar with some of these, at the Complexity Center in Imperial. And these are all the students that came up with the ideas. And this is the real, if it works. Show you. And this is our avatar. As pretty cool guy.
Very chill.
Very chill, yes. Okay, thank you.
So in the graph of volatility, you say they can predict 1 to 5 days. How do you define that variability? Because usually
empirically.
What is it how precise it was? It was precise up to 1 day to 5 days. What is that?
Okay, so good question. So what there are thresholds. So always say 0.